Welcome again to another Bible study from the Church of the Four Gospels. On my website, you'll see, and I asked a question, and I will bring this up here. Why God chose four Gospels for the New Testament. And you can do research on it, and you'll find many, many different answers. And what I have on here is approximately when the Gospels were written. And I want to address also the fourth gospel. There is some controversy there, but we're going to first kind of just gauge as to why God chose four gospels from four different perspectives. And even today, we know that if someone even files a complaint or a police report, you get these four distinctive viewpoints. And so that's what we have here. And if we look at the Gospels, we have Matthew's, Mark, Luke, and the fourth Gospel, giving credit to John the Apostle. And I'm going to get into more of that later on. But let us look at the Gospel of Matthew's. And again, you have to do your research as to why the historians chose Matthew's as writing the book of Matthew's. But when you read it, and I'll say this, I remember reading this about 30 years ago, written by Dr. Harold Wilmington, who was the dean of the Liberty Church. And in that teaching, in that reading, it just kind of stuck with me. He says that Matthews, being a tax collector, saw Jesus as this kind of king. So when he wrote his gospel, he wrote it from the perspective of seeing Jesus as a kind of king. As a matter of fact, if you even look at his genealogy that he wrote down, and being a Jew, a Hebrew, he also stopped or started with Abraham to Jesus, which is interesting because when we get in the book of Luke, we'll see where he wrote his a little bit more in depth. Then we have Mark, and remember now, Mark is also referred to as John Mark, who was a very humble servant. And as a matter of fact, you remember he wasn't uh, um, one of Paul's fired up guys, where he was fired up for the gospel like Paul was. And Paul somewhat dismissed him, but later on brought Mark back. But when he did, Mark, uh, I guess at that point or at that time was thinking, I can't, because when we look at when the Gospels were written, they were written many years, many centuries after the death of Jesus Christ. So when Mark wrote his Gospel, he saw Jesus as this kind of servant. And then when we look at the book or the Gospel of Luke, now remember the first four or the first three Gospels are what we call the Synoptic Gospels. They all basically tell the same story from different perspectives. They have some differences, some things that were added and not, like, for instance, Luke was a physician and a historian. Luke was not an eyewitness to any of these things, but what he did, he talked to eyewitnesses and got their account on what happened. And Luke saw Jesus as this perfect man. And I don't know if it's because of his profession, being a physician and a historian, but he wanted to make sure that everything was very accurate. And so he saw Jesus as this perfect man. So from his perspective, so these are some of the reasons why we see Jesus, or we see these gospels, and why we have four gospels, because they're all written in different perspectives. And we do the same thing. And it's so interesting how some people relate to one gospel more so than the other. But what also it does is also confirms the various stories, from different people, from different timelines, and they all tell the same story, and they complement each other, which also helps us to see that, hey, this thing is real, this thing is solid, and we can believe in what the Word of God says. Now we get to the fourth gospel. Now, many years ago, uh, I didn't question who wrote the fourth gospel. It was John. I mean, we grew up in the church. Matthews, Mark, Luke, and John. And so, about maybe 20 years ago or so, uh, I went and watched a movie called The Gospel of John, and I was impressed with it because the entire dialogue was written or came from the Gospel of John. And so I did a little research on the actors, and I wanted to see who was acting in that, whether they were Christians or, whatever the case may be. But I came across an article that says who wrote or who was the actual author of the fourth gospel. And immediately I took defense. And I said, well, John was, never really researching. I said, John was, and I said, I'm going to prove to this guy that John wrote the fourth gospel. So I did my research. I'm looking all through. I'm just searching, and I'm all over the place. And I couldn't find anything. I found no evidence, nowhere, that John, the apostle, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, was the writer. Nothing concrete. But what I did find is that the translators said, well, it was their best guess. Slightly because John was part of the inner circle with James, John, and Peter, when you could see different areas of the Bible where they were again part of Jesus' inner circle, even at the transfiguration, which we also going to look at. And so I didn't realize that this argument has been going on for centuries about who was the author of the fourth gospel. And so if you also notice, and I got it up here on the screen, when the gospels were written, and according to historians, and I'm not going to argue with this, and I pulled up various things, and they all seem to collaborate the same thing. As you see, Mark was written around 66 or 70 A.D., which is about 40 years after Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke both were about 50 years after Jesus' death. And keep in mind, John's gospel was written 65 years after Jesus' death. Now, again, we see all these different timelines. And what I want to point out real quickly, remember the writer, right? The writer of the Gospel of John refers to himself as a disciple. So when I was growing up and I would read that, I read that he was a disciple, but yet it was accredited to apostle. And John was made an apostle when Jesus returned from the dead, and he was with them for 40 days, and he promoted and breathed on them that they become apostles. He gave them the power to be apostles. And let me address this real quick. We hear people refer to themselves as an apostle. And I'm always amazed at from whose authority, because the apostles made this thing famous, but in reality, apostles, and the word apostle has been around before then. And what an apostle is a person who's given authority from the person who has authority to carry out their message. And whatever they say, right, is just like it came from the person that gave them the authority. So when I hear people around here calling themselves apostles, and I'm like, then did Jesus appear to you and give you the power to be apostles like Paul? And then even on that qualification, Paul had to go to the original apostles and be verified by them. And of course, none of these apostles are in existence right now. I just had to touch up on that, because the reason I say this is because when John, long before the Gospel of John was written, right, he was an apostle. So why does he refer to himself as a disciple whom Jesus loved in the writings? Now, something else I want to point out. In the Gospels, and as you see, I have my Bible up here, there is the story of the Transfiguration. And if you're familiar with it, This is when Jesus he brings Peter and he brings James and he brings John, and before their eyes there's a transfiguration where Jesus is his reflection is white, whiter than any fuller. In other words, whiter than any cleaner can make it. And Elisha and a Moses appears with him, and they're in a conversation. And Matthews, Mark, and Luke, if you look at the scriptures above, all write about this transfiguration, which happened about 40 days prior to Jesus' crucifixion. Now, when we look at the Gospel of John, it is never in there, never written about. And what we also want to look at is, let's just look at the 9th, 17 and 9. And Jesus gives them command. He says, and as they come down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, saying, tell this vision to no man until the Son of Man has risen again. And Luke and Mark, he records the same thing, that he is given also the command. So if John is given the command to write about the transfiguration, he never did. And why wouldn't he? It was his gospel. But I tell you what I would like for us to do is take a look at John 21 and 20. And what we want to look at here real quickly is, listen to this, because see, this thing never made sense to me. A couple of things never made sense. Why would Peter turn and ask about a man? And if you read it right here, John 21:20, then Peter turning about and seeing the disciple Jesus loved following him, it also put the same person that lead on his breast and asked who would betray. And seeing him, he asked him, well, what about this man? And Jesus' response, if I would that he tarry till I come, what is that to you? So what's interesting is that why would Peter all of a sudden turn and ask about the Apostle John? What about, see, that never made sense to me. It just did not clear. And the guy, and if you look at it, and he refers to himself, he said, and that this disciple should not die until Jesus come, and you read the story, but that wasn't the case. But this disciple, he refers to himself as a disciple. What I would like for you to do at some point, if you look at my website, you'll see right here where it says why God chose the 4 Gospels. I have written here, or I have highlighted John. And if you click on it, you'll come across this book. And this book has been, it actually cleared up a lot of things. Remember now, John's gospel, unlike Matthew's, Mark, and Luke, who saw him as a king, saw him as a servant, saw him as a perfect man, John's gospel, or the 4th gospel, saw Jesus as God himself, which to me gives a great impact on why when we read John 1 and 1. And if you take a look at this Bible, or take a look at this book, and I talked with this gentleman right here. We talked about 3 hours. The first time I came across it, this is the guy I wanted to prove to him that John wrote the 4th gospel. And when I found no proof, I had to read this book. And when I read this book, my eyes were open and I was enlightened, because this is an awesome book in revealing who the author is. And I am so convinced, I can tell you right now, church, John could not have written the gospel. Simple fact is, the gospel was written some 65 years after Jesus' death. John was already an apostle before Jesus ascended back up into heaven, which we read in Acts. So why would he turn and refer to himself as a disciple whom Jesus loved? There's a scripture in there that calls out this person, who the disciple is. Anyway, thank you again for joining me. And remember, in the beginning was the Word.